So welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our session on assessing, modeling and analyzing land use and land management impacts on the Earth system. So a quite broad session that we're excited about with 3 parts throughout the day. My name is Julia Pongratz. I'm from the University of Munich and chairing together with Heinz Erb from BOKU Vienna. And without much ado, I'd like to ask the first speaker, Richard Fuchs, to the podium.
And one sentence before Richard gets started. Please, those who sit on the edges, those of you who plan to stay longer, please move a little bit to the center so that people who come in have a little bit space of spreading. And I think also upstairs is open, but we are not too crowded at the moment. Okay, good. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. So welcome everyone. I have the pleasure to guide you through the next 10 minutes through the trends in fertilizer use efficiency of the world's biggest crop producers. And I want to start with the general overall trends in fertilizer use. And you probably know that since the 60s, fertilizer application has risen quite drastically. So the synthetic fertilizer application by about 500%. And without the fall of the Soviet Union, that would be a direct steep increase. And we have seen static maps of the current situation about certain fertilizer types, maybe also linked to crop types. We also have seen dynamic maps back in time, but this was only about the total fertilizer use and application. But what we are lacking at the moment are a bit in-depth views. So how were specific crops fertilized by specific fertilizer types? And how did the yields respond to that, especially to the big crops? And are there differences in amongst the regions? And a key component is also, was it efficient? I mean, if someone applied more fertilizers, did it also result in a receivable outcome? And what are the underlying drivers of differences that we see amongst the region? So what is fertilizer use efficiency? If you think of a system, the efficiency is basically the comparison of the input versus the output. If we translate this to croplands, fertilizer application is basically the input into the production system and yield is the output. And by comparing the input versus the output, we can get a sense of the efficiency of the system. But why is it important? Because it's a very fragile system. If we apply too little fertilizers, that means we have lower crop productivity and we also start to degrade the soil by mining the fertility of the soil. But if you apply too much, then we have all negative consequences, the environmental pollution, which is affecting the ecosystem health, the food security, and so on. So what we are striving for in a theoretical world is that we want to improve the efficiency, because that means we kind of keep the high output or even improve it, but we are lowering the inputs over time. That would result in an increase in efficiency, which would mean we avoid these environmentally negative inputs like fertilizer and therefore get an increased sustainability. And just for clarification, you can have different definitions of fertilizer use efficiency, but what we don't mean here is the direct uptake of the plant or the optimal plant nutrition, because we are looking more from a system level. So we compare the input and output of the system, which also is affected by other factors. For example, the efficiency could increase by new breeds or irrigations or environmental constraints. So for the study setup, what you usually have is the FAO data with synthetic fertilizer application of various types. You have the crop harvest area, yield, and so on. But what's a major bottleneck is that you don't have data that links specific fertilizer types to specific crop types. And for this study, we were able to get, unfortunately, not public reports from the International Fertilizer Association, providing exactly this kind of data, how much fertilizer per specific crop was applied, completing that also with recent manure data on cropland, only nitrogen. So in total, we were analyzing 11 different crop types or groups. So we had wheat as a separate crop, but then other cereals as another crop type, for example, 4 different crop types, fertilizer types per country per year. And then we had a very data-rich period of these IFA reports where we can work really data-driven. And then we are trying to extrapolate this back to 1960s. And for this talk, we want to aim for the big 5, so China, United States, India, Europe, and Brazil, which cover roughly 60% of the world's crop production and 70% of the world fertilizer consumption. And if we dive directly into the result, this is how we started to analyze this. So at the bottom line here, at the x-axis, you have the dry yields in kilogram per hectare per year. And here you have the fertilizer application rate also at kilogram per hectare per year. You have India in violet, you have Brazil in green, you have China in orange, and you have US in light blue, and you have the EU in dark blue. And you can divide these panels in more or less high input, high output, and so on by dividing it, or by separating this by the global mean at some year. And what you see is that all the main producers are basically going for high input, high output. But you see some variations in there. The direction is still obvious, but India is still lagging a little behind. Brazil made a major leap in this time period here, from low input and low output to high input, high output. You see that China increased massively the fertilizer amount up to diminishing returns and yields at some point. And then with a new policy of a new 5-year plan, they made a complete turnaround at some point and now going backwards in that direction. The US more or less stable, and the EU is surprisingly the only bigger crop producer that changed the trend towards this line here. They are not in this panel here, but the trend is clearly showing in that direction. You can start looking at this in more detail. So you have the dry yields here again, the fertilizer application with the peak year, so you see the differences amongst the region. And what you see is that the yields are quite linear increasing. But the fertilizer application rate is changing quite a lot. And this is in the end affecting the fertilizer use efficiency. But you could also turn this around and basically say, whatever you apply on the field, it doesn't affect the yields. So the conclusion would be that you're still applying too much fertilizer on the fields without getting any major benefits for the dry yields. It gets more complicated, but also more interesting if you separate this by different fertilizer types. So you see, for example, they have different axes here, that nitrogen is often 2 to 3 times the amount as other fertilizer types. You see, for example, Brazil performing quite well with synthetic nitrogen, but still it's part of the crop composition of the country, that mostly of the production is soybean, which is a nitrogen-fixing plant, therefore you need less nitrogen. China is still skyrocketing here for nitrogen application and all the other crop types as well. Europe still facing major problems with manure application, but the trend is going downwards. Also in all the panels we see that for Europe. You can also do this for different crop types. And you also see that the typical specialists like Europe with wheat at the forefront of yield production. And still the main producers are going upwards in that direction. There are few exceptions. US is surprisingly efficient for soybean production, whereas Brazil isn't. It probably has to do with the environmental constraints, that you have poorer nutrition soils in the tropics, but then also crop rotation might play a role here, because you see that often in the US soybean and maize is planted in crop rotation, and you see quite low soybean fertilizer application, but quite high for maize. So it's probably also hard to distinguish these two types from each other. And still you could argue, okay, this might be affected by the environmental constraints. Some countries might have better climate conditions than others and therefore produce higher yields and so on. But you could also look at the temporal trends. So this is kind of from the starting point where they are, whether they're able to improve or not. And so in bold numbers here, you see the trends over time. Negative means they are decreasing their fertilizer efficiency. In positive number means they are improving, and in brackets you see the fraction of share of production in these regions. And I didn't account it for the weight of the different area, but I just highlighted here in green for which kind of crop types a region is performing better than the others. Surprisingly, Europe is not doing so well for wheat, although it's the biggest fraction. However, the US is doing good for maize and also for soybeans, and therefore also being the overall leader here for the increase in fertilizer use efficiency. But you also see that Europe is dominating mainly throughout the various crop types, whereas the US is more focusing on the special crops they're focusing on. And then it comes to trade. A lot of these crops that are produced are not consumed in the countries where they are. So on the one hand, you see here the exporters to other world regions. These areas here also indicate the amount of world trade to other regions. So the US is the biggest, Brazil is second. And here you see the main receiving regions, also the EU and China. And here you see the crop types, what they are trading. So you have soybean in yellow, you have maize in green, and you have in blue, or what is it, wheat, I think it's blue or brown. And it's quite striking that almost 3/4 of the trade of the big five is soybean, maize, and wheat. The main exporters are US, Brazil, main importers EU and China. And although we see Europe performing quite well in the fertilizer use efficiency within Europe, we see that it's massively importing soybeans from Brazil with a quite low fertilizer use efficiency. So a lot of this production was outsourced, but then still imported. And you could also question, they are achieving a higher fertilizer use efficiency within Europe. And even if you say, okay, there are some constraints for soybeans, why didn't they switch to other oilseed crops to substitute this? Because they would still be better. So we get another component than just deforestation, is also the efficiency in fertilizer use that plays a role here. And to sum up some of the key findings, so fertilizer use efficiency is improving only at a minor rate. It's quite surprising. But there are some major changes for specific crops. And the efficiency is quite dependent on the crop and fertilizer type. We see quite some differences between developed and developing countries, but also for regions that focus on global versus domestic markets. So a clear example is Europe versus the US. Still higher fertilizer use efficiency are achieved with high biomass crops like maize and also sugarcane. Mainly because they are used for different uses, not only for consumption, because for maize it's often feed where you take the entire plant with the biomass, and not only the corn cobs for human nutrition, which increases in higher efficiency, the same for sugarcane for ethanol production. And we are working towards putting this on the map for the Earth system modeling. I can just show you some of the teasers, what we are just doing a couple of days ago. So we're trying to produce maps like this. For example, here the wheat harvest fraction in Europe, and associating that with yields. The next step would be to divide the yields by the fertilizer use efficiency to get to the application rate, and then provide this for every crop type and fertilizer type. So this is how we did it. Briefly, the Monfreda data set combined with crop area from Navin Ramankuti, plus our fertilizer study to get these maps. But we're also planning to combine this with a new land cover reconstruction by Karina, which will present a new land cover reconstruction in the afternoon session. So just a teaser for that. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have time for a few questions because we have one talk less in this session. We can allow a bit more discussion in between.
So you related the yield per fertilizer type, 4 types of fertilizer. What yield did you take for that? Did you take the total yield and related it to each of the fertilizers, or did you have the yield per field that was fertilized with
No,
that
this
type.
you can't do. It's still the total yield, but what we did is we only referred to dry yields, so taking or making different crop types comparable. For example, if you have watery plants like a melon, it's basically the weight comes from water, which we don't want to account for it, but the dry yields itself is still the total. We can't divide it by fertilizer type.
Yeah, I was thinking that these data is probably not available, but
No.
if I think of crop yields at home or crop fields at home, it's probably not one type of fertilizer that is applied. It's usually,
No, it's usually
like
a
multiple
combination. You have
types
this
and
kind
also
of, you have a mix of components that are applied at the same time, and you can't distinguish what is developing for the plant.
But I guess that would make a big difference. When they are applied during the year, what would be the...
Unfortunately, we only have yearly dates, so we can't separate within the year. Within the year, we don't know the exact application date. It might be possible for some regions, but definitely not on the global level.
Yeah, guess so. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Could you just speak up?
Maybe I didn't pay attention and you told it, but I wonder because from the FAO you normally only have fertilizer data per country.
Yeah.
So how did you allocate this fertilizer to different crops?
Yeah. So there's the month. Yeah. This is here. So for the year 2000, you have this crop species map, spatially explicit from Manfreda. And we use that as a crude assumption, okay, that the species are roughly staying in the same place for the amount of time because we don't know how they changed within the region. Of course, it's a very blunt assumption, but that's the only thing we can do at the moment. And then we combine this with the changing crop area, and then we adjusted the yields to the crop types depending on the trends we got from our fertilizer study. And then with the yields, you can attach the fertilizer application rates to that.
Have a suggestion.
Yeah.
In terms of the data source, why not use the International Fertilizer Association? Yeah, you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the availability and uncertainty is more sophisticated, especially during the 10 years. It's very so because I measured it in fertilizer use, especially for fertilizer use efficiency. In agricultural science, it's not the definition is not right. It's a potassium fertilizer use efficiency. So can you perhaps you can update the definition of fertilizer use efficiency?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's disappointing because it's quite a treasury to have this kind of data, and it's not public. For anyone who wants to work on that, I can just recommend to write them and ask for it, and they're happy to provide it, but they don't put it up.
You can register membership.
Yeah, but this is costly, but because you have to pay for it, and you have to convince them that you're a scientist and doing this for public good, and then you have a few emails back and forth. And
So huge amount of fertilizer products, and they are divided into 3 types of fertilizer.
Yeah.
Nitrogen, phosphorus, and
Yeah.
calcium.
Yeah.
That is more scientific.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Good. Thanks again, Richard.
Thank you.
We'll move on. The next. Yeah. The next speaker is myself, and I'll be speaking about about the uncertainties related to global land use emission estimates. Thank you. Excellent. So this is a very coarse global scale that I'm dealing with here. And therefore, I'm coming from the perspective of global Earth system models, global vegetation models, or bookkeeping models. So please take that into account when you're asking questions later. I motivate why we are working on this global scale with the global carbon cycle. you may know the Global Carbon Project, whose main product is the annual Global Carbon Budget, which is brought out each year in fall in time for the Conference of the Parties. And there we try to quantify where, how much humans have emitted and the fate of those emissions. So this is natural carbon cycle. You see atmosphere and land and atmosphere and ocean exchange quite a bit of carbon. The disturbance fluxes by humans are much smaller, but they bring the system out of equilibrium, so therefore they're so important. Average over the last decade, the best estimate is that we have about 9.4 petagrams carbon from fossil fuel emissions and about 1.5 from land use change, which remain in the atmosphere to about 50%, and the rest is taken up by the ocean and the land, with the land sink increasing over the last years. I'd like to point out here that we have these huge uncertainties on the land side, on both land terms, the terrestrial sink and the land use emissions. And this is 50% of the best estimate that we have, but when you go to the individual models, you may see that they differ by a factor of 10 easily for global land use emissions. And so it's a fair question to ask why. And there's been, so first we need to understand how these global land use emission estimates come about. So there's two methods how the budget works. The first is they're using dynamic global vegetation models. Those models, they're process-based. They calculate photosynthesis, respiration, and so on. They have climate forcing and variability. These DGVMs are, for example, JS Bach, Joules, LPJ, and so on. They perform two simulations. Both have climate and CO2 changes as we observe them over the history. One has land use change, the other doesn't. From the second simulation, we get the terrestrial sink, undisturbed by humans. What would happen if there were no humans? And this terrestrial sink, because of CO2 fertilization, is rather big in the history. And if you take the difference of those two simulations, you get the net land use change flux. Historically, there's about 1.5 petagrams carbon into the atmosphere. That's another approach taken in the global carbon budget to quantify land use emissions, and these are bookkeeping models. You may know the studies by Ski Houghton, who published his first model in 1983 and then updated it ever since. In the last years, a new model came out by my group, the bookkeeping of land use emission model, blue. They're very simple. They have no processes like the DGVMs do. They know only about carbon densities in soil and vegetation for different biomes. They know the area changes between them. And we know the response curves, how quickly regrowth happens, what happens with the cleared material, over what time is it respired back to the atmosphere. And from that, you get the net land use change flux in a different way. This, you see, is already different to the DGVMs. This knows nothing about climate and CO2 changing over time. Good, and this is the result from the global carbon budget. So you see the land use emissions per year over the last 50 years. The two bookkeeping models, blue and Houghton and Nasikas in red, you see that they differ a lot. In green, you have the DGVMs. That trendy V7 are 16 DGVMs participating in last year's budget, and you see the model spread around. So this is where this uncertainty range of 0.7 as a standard deviation comes from, but in fact, across models, the uncertainty is even larger. Currently, to get this 1.5 petagrams, we average the two bookkeeping models, and we take the DGVMs only for the uncertainty estimate around. Good, what are the reasons now why the spread is so big? One, of course, is process comprehensiveness. Bookkeeping models claim to present all processes, all land management, and so on, because we're using observed carbon densities, so implicitly it should be all there. The DGVMs, they have a hard time implementing all these processes separately, and so therefore it's a gradual process into getting more comprehensive, and the DGVMs differ. Some have erosion, tillage, harvesting, others don't. In the study led by Almut Arnett, we tested how much the land use change emissions globally change in percentage here when you include individual land management practices. And these are different models here. You see, depending on management practice and model, something between +10 and +100%, adding land management. So this is why this is a priority in the modeling community now, getting the Earth system models better in management practices. Then, accounting for climate and CO2 changes. As I said, bookkeeping models know nothing about that. DGVMs do. And this is a big difference in terms of the loss of additional sink capacity. What do I mean here? When you clear a forest, you're losing an additional sink that you could have, because the forest responds very well to CO2 fertilization. It takes up the CO2 and it stores it because it has this long-term storage in wood. Cropland is harvested every year. It can store carbon, additional carbon due to CO2 fertilization. And so what happens when you clear that forest? You're losing this additional sink over time. The DGVMs, because they have this no land use simulation as a reference, know of this potential sink that is gone now. The bookkeeping models don't. And this loss of initial sink capacity has been quantified now for the first time in this year's budget from the DGVMs. This is the land use emission estimates I showed you before with transient climate. But if we keep climate fixed at pre-industrial levels, we get much lower emissions. The difference is this loss of initial sink capacity. And it's about 0.5 or 0.7 in the very last year's petagrams carbon per year, so substantial. And this is also a reason for why trends in the recent decades differ between models. A third reason for discrepancy is that most models are run by exactly the same land use data set. We'll get to that later, but we're not quite sure how to implement it. So let's say we know about cropland and pasture expanding somewhere, but which natural vegetation type in our grid cell should we take for that? The forest, the shrubland, the natural grassland? Very often cropland is allocated proportionally on all natural types that occur in a grid cell. For pasture, some models prefer to take it first from grassland and only when we run out of grassland from the forest. It makes a big difference if you apply this rule for pasture as compared to proportional allocation. You get much more forest saved. This map shows you how much forest you would save in percent if you preferentially took natural grassland first. And there's no clear rule what to do. And then there's the global land use data. When I submitted the abstract and the organizers reviewed it, one made a comment that he or she hopes I would speak about uncertainties related to the global land use data sets some more. And so I put a special focus here in this talk. The global land use data set that is most commonly used is LUH2. It's the land use harmonization product by the group of George Hurd at the University of Maryland. And it's used both in the Global Carbon Project for almost all models apart from the one by Ski Houghton, which uses FAO and FRA directly. And it's also used in CMIP6. That's a coupled model intercomparison project, so the kind of IPCC simulations that are currently underway. And so therefore it's really crucial to understand the features of this data set better. So what this data set does, it goes back to the height 3.2 data set on cropland and pasture rangeland taken directly from Kees Klein-Goldewig from FAO. Then they add shifting cultivation based on Andreas Heinemann and Ole Merz's work. So you go from net to gross transitions in each grid cell. Wood harvesting is added, and then there's a harmonization of the historical land use to future scenarios because that's needed for the IPCC simulations, but it doesn't have to bother us here. And in the end, you have transitions between a whole range of different types of primary land, secondary land, agricultural types at a quarter degree since the year 850. So it's an amazing data set there. It's globally consistent. It's a long time series. It's exactly what models need. So let's look a bit more into it. The first issue that arises with this data set is you have to cover a long time span. The carbon cycle needs centuries to react to a land use change. And therefore, you really need to go back many centuries in time. That's a big challenge. And then here's a picture for the emissions, again, just for equatorial Africa. And you see strange features like a big peak in the 1950s of emissions. And you see that in several other regions too. Where does this come from? Well, we dug a bit into it, and you realize you can look at the agricultural areas from height directly, and you see this increase and then a stagnation in 1950 in all types, cropland, rangelands, pastures. This stagnation happens because 1960 is when FAO data comes in. What has been done by Kees prior to 1960? Well, he used population to scale back land use. And you see the population curve here. And in particular in Africa, there was a big increase in population in the 1940s and 50s. And then because land use emissions are the second derivative of land use area, you get this big increase, the spike in emissions, and then it goes down after you start with the flattening of the FAO time series. So you will definitely see this in the Earth system model simulations of the IPCC. We're expecting 2 to 3 ppm CO2 deviation from observations just because of that feature. second challenge, we have to be global, and therefore, of course, there's little room to integrate country-level data, regional data at best. Here's an illustration of that problem. You see in Russia, these two peaks in blue and these two dips here. So those dips, obviously, that's related to the two world wars. But that the emissions increased so much before, is that real or not? Well, it's again scaled with population in the absence of FAO data in LUH2. And population increased. What's not known is that regionally, in Russia, there was big problems before those wars. There was part of the population was close to starving. They were moving from the rural lands to the urban areas. So you can't work with fixed per capita values of land use. This is different in Skihouten's estimate, that's flatter, but there's also issues there. He's really using not population, but actual historical data on land use and harvesting. And when you go back to all the original data that's put in there, you realize there's a data gap around the First World War, and that's smoothed out. So that's also not the best solution, because not using population, you're missing out on this part of the First World War. Good, so that's this data gap issue. And then a last point, I was wondering how to phrase it. So let's say it's frictional losses by having multiple groups being involved in producing one final product. And there's hard deadlines with CMIP6, with the budget each year, so there's a lot of pressure, and you have to produce a product, and you can't go in all the details right away. And this in Brazil caused big problems in recent years, which will also be part of the CMIP6 simulations, unfortunately. So you see these big increases in the last 20 years in Brazil, which stem from that some updates in height didn't make their way into LUH2, that somehow strange variability was introduced in the last years. This will be fixed in the next year's global carbon budget. And these emissions are so strong, you even see them on a global scale. And these emissions are also not realistically attributed to the space realm, because they occur mostly in the Atlantic forest, which we know has been deforested decades ago. Good, so to sum up, models get better, we have more processes integrated, but this doesn't mean the model spread gets smaller. And many important processes like forest degradation are still missing in most models. The definitions of land use change flux, if it includes loss of additional sink capacity or doesn't, is very important, and those rules for implementation. This is being recognized, and there's now more rules and guidelines put out, but it's a process that's continuing. And long global time series are, of course, tricky. The historical data is needed, at least at the regional scale. You can't go to country level for this work. And one option would be to move to remote sensing for the last decades, but of course, there's a longer history to take care of. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Julia. Oops, sorry. Questions? I see one. Maybe in the back, you, Manan, you just talk loud.
And you can just repeat.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julia. I have 3 questions, but I'll say one for later. I want to know, first of all, I want to know your opinion about, so a lot of scientists like Houghton and Asikas, they refer to a residual land sink, and they say it's probably in the tropics, the residual land sink. And I think if that is explained, then that will decrease uncertainties with respect to the CO2 emissions in a way. So what are your opinions about the residual land sink?
So the residual land sink is no longer residual, luckily. From this year on, or from last year on, it's really determined from the DGVMs independently, and the residual term is put in a budget imbalance term. But the sink is still attributed very strongly to the tropical forests, which is why we definitely need phase experiments there, because we have no clue if the CO2 fertilization really acts that strongly on rainforest.
And my second question is that you mentioned George's database and how it's being updated. I've read his previous publication, and the point about shifting cultivation, he does take into account shifting cultivation based on, I think, a 1980s map of shifting cultivation. So I want to know, how is Heidelman's data on shifting cultivation different from how he has considered it previously?
So this old Butler map from the 1980s, I think, yeah, that was super coarse, right? It had just these regions, and within those, George assumed it's a 15 years lifetime of cropland. And with the work from Ola and Andreas, the times are specific, right? You know the rotational cycle and that changes is different in different regions. But we don't know yet quite in which region it's now stronger or less strong compared to the 2011 data set, the LUH1. I hope to speak with Andreas here today.
Yeah. There are two questions. First pass it to Richard.
Yeah, just a quick one. If you have to prioritize where the land use community should focus on for new models, would it be more the historic historic period to improve the spin-up phase, or would it be the more recent data to get a better grip on the recent trends?
So from the carbon cycle perspective, we need this history. We can't start in 1950. If you're going for the perspective of local adaptation and energy and water fluxes, it's the last decades that are sufficient. But my heart is with both, so I can't prioritize. Yeah. No, the long time period is really crucial because this is the hard work that the modelers can't do, where really the land system folks like you are needed to guide us.
But would it improve the accuracy of the product? Would it improve the accuracy of the product more than getting the more recent trends right? I mean, of course you have this priority, but would it be more efficient for decreasing the uncertainty?
Well, for the last decades, I guess it's more important to get the last decades right. But if we want to look at 1950s, then I think it's not that we need to get today correct, we need the high time series. And it's important when we're speaking about mitigating via land use change, it's always reverting something from the past or learning from the past. And so if you don't capture that correctly, we're missing out on this learning experience.
I have two more. I think you last, but I have Patrick first. Mark.
Great. So I can understand why there are large differences between the process-based models, but there also seem to be large differences between the bookkeeping models in both trends, but particularly in variability. Do you know why? Because
of the land use forcing. Because Skihouten is using FAO and FRA directly, and they excluded shifting cultivation in this updated product, and we're using LUH2. And the trend issue is mostly this Brazil feature, and the variability is also because LUH2 has annual variability, while Skihouten's is by definition a 5-year smoothing.
So dare I ask, is one better than the other?
That's a tricky one.
I know.
No, that's hard. So these land use data, I think that's great benefit in the additional layers that LUH2 provides, like the shifting cultivation, the wood harvesting, to have that consistent, which you wouldn't have using FAO, FRA directly. The models are fairly similar in their structure, only that blue is spatially explicit. So no, I think it's good that we have those two. I'd advocate for including the DGVMs too in the land use emissions, but the community, which I belong to partly too, is reluctant.
Okay, thank you. The pre-last question.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. Could you please expand a bit on your wish list towards remote sensing? Because obviously it cannot deal with a 100-year span, but what would you like to see since, let's say, the 70s?
So Matt Hansen's data set is great in terms of that it has this very high resolution, so you can get at these gross transitions, because based on Landsats, 30 meters. But the problem is forest transitions is not the only thing we need to know. We really need to know, is it cropland, pasture, or just some grazing natural vegetation? And we need to distinguish the natural disturbances very clearly from the anthropogenic ones to separate, so because that's important for the political realm. The other aspect about remote sensing is so getting the land use transitions correct would be great, but you could also invert the bookkeeping models, and you say you use a time series of biomass changes. And then you could reconstruct the land use changes through these bookkeeping models. And a last third point, so biomass changes, land use transitions, but also just equilibrium biomass stocks from observations. So even just one time slot from remote sensing at very high resolution, biome specific, would be wonderful, because then you could feed that into the bookkeeping models and replace those coarse biome level data they have.
Thank you. And I have a last question over there. Can you speak up? Is that possible?
Yes,
Let's try. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Julia. And I think we move on. The next speaker is Ronny.
Yes, welcome from my side, and thank you for giving me the chance to present my work here, even though it's somewhat untypical for that conference, I think. So I will present some results of accounting for biomass heat storage in the community land model. When it comes to the climatic impacts of land cover changes, such as afforestation, there is two types of effects, or two categories. There is the biogeochemical effects that Julia Pongratz just talked about, so the sequestration or release of greenhouse gases. But then land cover changes can also affect the local water and energy balance directly, and this we call the biogeophysical effects that tend to act more on a local to regional scale. This is an example of a study looking at these local biogeophysical effects by comparing temperature measurements over forest sites to nearby grassland temperature measurements in North America. And as you can see here, during the day, the forest measurements tend to be actually colder in temperature than the measurements over the grassland sites, and at the same time the daily minimum temperature is actually higher in the forest sites. So overall, forests have a dampening effect on the diurnal temperature range. Unfortunately, the nighttime warming effect is not very well represented in the land surface model I am using. So on the left, you have remote sensing observations of the local land surface temperature difference at night between forest minus grass and cropland. And then to the right of it, you have the same plot for CLM. And as you can see, the CLM is clearly negative biased for this nighttime land surface temperature difference. We see something similar when running the model at point scale, in that case at the needle leaf site in North America. So in black you see the observed land surface temperature, and then in red the simulated land surface temperature of the uncorrected model. And as you can see during the nights here, we have a very strong negative bias. One process that could help to alleviate this bias is biomass heat storage. So basically the idea is that the biomass is absorbing solar radiation and also sensible heat during the day, and it is releasing this energy back to the canopy airspace during the night, mainly in form of sensible heating again. There is several observational studies around that estimated such biomass heat storage fluxes. This is for a needle leaf site in Sweden during summer. And as you can see, the biomass heat flux here shown in green shows a quite distinct diurnal cycle. So in this presentation, I will show to you results from two kinds of simulations. First, we made some offline simulations with CLM 5.0, which we forced by a prescribed atmosphere from the GSWP3 reanalysis dataset. And then we also made some simulations that were coupled to the atmosphere using the regional climate model Cosmos CLM squared, which couples the atmospheric component of the Cosmo climate model to the community land model 4.5. And with this model, we did some idealized experiments over maximally afforested Europe. So starting with the offline simulations, we can here see the diurnal range of the biomass heat flux, so the daily maximum minus the daily minimum value, which in some region even exceeds 75 watts per square meters, which is quite substantial. And if we look at where we actually have forests in the model, we can clearly see that the biomass heat flux tends to be high where we have forests, which appears quite obvious as forests have a much larger biomass and can therefore also store more energy during the diurnal cycle in comparison to, for example, grass or cropland. Now, when we look at the impact of biomass heat storage on the 2-meter temperature, we see for the daily maximum 2-meter temperature a very moderate cooling effect. However, a much more pronounced warming effect during the night, which frequently exceeds 1 Kelvin, again in those forested regions. And this diurnal asymmetry also results in the fact that the daily mean 2-meter temperature is increased quite considerably as well by biomass heat storage. This plot is showing the bias in the diurnal temperature range of CLM 5.0 in comparison to MODIS remote sensing observations. And if we again consult this forest fraction map, we can quickly see that CLM tends to overestimate the diurnal temperature range in regions where we have a lot of forests, and it tends to underestimate it in deserted regions. And as I just showed you, biomass heat storage strongly increases the nighttime temperature in forests, and it slightly decreases the daytime temperature. So it dampens the diurnal temperature cycle, resulting in this very consistent improvement of the simulated diurnal temperature range by the model in comparison to the remote sensing observations in the forested regions. Yeah, we see something similar when looking at the local land surface temperature difference during the night between forest minus grass and cropland. So on the left you have again a MODIS-based data set similar to the one that I showed in the introduction. And then in the middle we have the default version of the model that, as already shown in the introduction as well, has this strong negative bias in this difference. And as you can see, the biomass heat storage simulation here, in this simulation, this bias is removed to a large extent. Now we come to the coupled simulation. So this plot is showing the summertime, nighttime land surface temperature effect of biomass heat storage. So we have a very similar signal that we already saw in the offline simulations with this very widespread warming here. And on the right you have an extract of the processes actually forming this overall signal. So we have the biomass heat storage that tries to warm the land surface. And then we have, however, a quite strong compensation by the sensible heat flux, resulting in this much more moderate warming effect due to biomass heat storage. When we look at the same plots for the winter, we actually see a very different picture than from what we would expect from the offline simulations. So we again have the biomass heat flux that tries to warm the land surface. And in this case, the sensible heat flux is actually at many locations overcompensating the biomass heat flux warming. So resulting in this cooling effect due to biomass heat storage even during the night that we would not necessarily expect. What we also observed is that there is an increase in the amount of convective precipitation during summer due to biomass heat storage. And going along with it, we see an increase in the convectively available potential energy. So to sum up, it appears that biomass heat storage significantly increases nighttime and also daily average temperatures in forested regions. By doing that, it reduces biases in the land cover sensitivity that we find in comparison to the MODIS remote sensing observations. And what we saw from the coupled simulations, it appears that biomass heat storage can induce considerable feedbacks in the atmosphere that we don't yet fully understand in some cases. So in future, we would like to have some convection resolving simulations to make our results more robust, especially concerning the increase in the convective precipitation amount that we find. Then we still need to fully assess how biomass heat storage affects conclusions made in land use change experiments. And it would be interesting to see the process implemented also in different land surface models to see if it has a similar effect there. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would also like to thank all the people that contributed to this study.
Thank you very much, Ronny. Who has questions?
Do these increased nighttime temperatures that you find affect plant respiration? And if they do, how do they affect plant respiration? So nighttime carbon losses.
I didn't look at the carbon fluxes in particular. I had a look at the evapotranspiration, and if I remember correctly, it increased the evapotranspiration. Unfortunately, I cannot recall, however, whether the increase was coming from during the night or coming more from during the day. Yeah, I should look at that.
Other questions? Would you mind speaking up?
Thanks for the presentation. If I recall correctly, in the Alchema and Studies paper, which looks at the effects of loss of forest on both maximum daily temperature and minimum daily temperature, at least in the tropics, they found very little effect of forest loss on minimum temperature, which is sort of, I imagine, similar to the nighttime temperature that you're looking at here. So I'm curious if you can explain the basic distinction between their findings and what you're asserting, especially for the tropics.
I would say my findings do not contradict these results necessarily. So actually, also I guess this paper is somewhat similar, or this data set in a methodology, also finding a rather moderate or still a slight cooling effect of forests during the night. And as you can see, the warming effect in the model, in the biomass heat storage version of the model, is not going crazy. So we see this signal that is close to zero during the night, and the regions where we actually see an increase in temperature due to forests are actually more in the mid-latitudes. So I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction to that study.
Other questions? May I quickly ask if there's, so it's great that so it's very compelling, right, that it looks better compared to the observed temperatures, but is there a way to directly measure the biomass heat storage, at least locally?
Yes, well, depends a bit how you define directly. I mean, but yeah, there is, I would say, like 15 studies around where they try to estimate these fluxes at in situ sites. There is different methods to do that. One method is, for example, to measure the temperature at different depths within the vegetation and just to estimate the energy that the vegetation is taking up or releasing from that, for example. Yeah, the study that I showed in the introduction with this needle leaf site at in Sweden is an example of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent, thanks. Good. Then, thank you again, Ronny. And I'd ask the next speaker, Di Vittorio, to join us. Ellen is speaking about the importance of land cover distribution for climate and the carbon cycle. Please, Ellen.
Thanks. Oh, that could be useful. I think this is mine too. All right, thanks for the opportunity to speak here today on behalf of myself and my co-authors who are listed here and all my colleagues who worked on the integrated Earth system model, which is what I'll be presenting some results from today. I should also thank Julia for providing a very nice background to the specific study that I'm going to present. Many of you have probably seen this graph on the left. This is from the C4 MIP experiment several years ago. This is the historical period simulations of 11 different Earth system models showing a plus or minus 12 part per million variability in the estimate of the atmospheric CO2. Maybe some of you have also seen this study on the right. It was a concentration study looking at net biome production across 8 different models, showing a relatively neutral terrestrial carbon uptake over that period, but a relatively high variability of plus or minus 100 petagrams of carbon. And this was the historical period. In the future period, they also report some studies. Unfortunately, they're different RCPs. There wasn't a emission-driven RCP 4.5 simulation group to show you, but just here on the left, that same C4 MIP study shows that the uncertainty in atmospheric CO2 over the 21st century grows considerably. It may be a little less if you did an RCP 4.5. The table on the right shows the net biome production estimates from 8 RCP 4.5 models that were concentration driven. Again, this shows rather in difference, this shows a net sink of carbon in the land during that period, but with about the same uncertainty in the estimate of plus or minus 100 petagrams of carbon. Now I guess I should say, a lot of people look at those results and have focused on biogeochemical processes and trying to understand how to reduce those uncertainties. And so I think what is less known, however, and this is because it generally isn't reported, it hasn't been reported, this will change in the current CMIP cycle with LUMIP, but they don't know that the land cover is different across all these models, both the initial land cover and the rates of change of land cover. This is an 11 model set that was presented by Lejeune et al. 2017. This is just a North American example, but it applies in different regions and globally. The dark green is forest, and then there are the other land cover types. You can see in 1870 on the left, they're all different, and on the right, those bars show the rate of change of the different land covers. So this is common. Julia referred to the fact that each of these models has different ways of implementing land use and land cover change. Oh, that's the wrong one. I think what is even less known, or maybe just taken for granted and less well understood, is that the land cover in these models is pretty much, or land cover change is pretty much driven by land use and land use change over time. And so here's an example of 2 different data sets in 1850, the top showing the fraction of natural vegetation in 1850 after long thousands of years of land use. And the bottom shows the amount of carbon estimated to be released from that landscape from each of these. And so they're very different, so it doesn't take much thought to think if you ran a historical simulation starting in 1850, starting from each of these different points, you're going to get very different results in terms of the carbon cycle and potentially also the atmospheric results. But most studies use the data on the right, or at least a newer version of it now. The model I'm presenting you today will use the HIDE 3.1, but everyone's starting to use HIDE 3.2 through the land use harmonization 2 data set these days, because Judd Kaplan's data, this data set ends in 1815, so you don't have the land use change over the recent historical period. So these simulations that we've done, these are historical simulations using the land-only version of the integrated Earth system model with the original land use harmonization data set. This was done at half degree. The starting point in 1850 is the same for all these simulations. And what this shows is that it's not just the land use that matters, but it's also where you put that land use, what vegetation you replace when you're doing this. And so these various colors here represent different ways of converting the land. So we have assumptions that maximize forest area, minimize forest area. There are a couple in the middle: crop rule, pasture rule, proportional, taking land proportionally from all the different land types. And then the blue line is the default simulation that actually uses a different method. So what we do is we look at the difference between the max forest and the min forest. We take that as an envelope of uncertainty, and we use that to estimate uncertainties in the climate and carbon projections. Now, what we we did several of these because the land-only simulation is relatively cheap. And so for the fully coupled atmosphere-ocean simulation, we just did historical runs for the minimum forest and maximum forest to get that envelope of initial conditions in 2005 that we then run through the same configuration to see how those initial conditions change the results over time. And so the question that I'm asking today is, what is the contribution of initial land cover uncertainty to the global projections? And briefly, the answer is that the global carbon cycle uncertainties in 2005 are exacerbated over time, and the local temperature uncertainties, local being a grid cell approximately 100 kilometer square, those uncertainties they persist throughout the century simulation that we do. And so we do an RCP 4.5 simulation with our model, and it's fully coupled, but we use the integrated Earth system model, which is basically the community Earth system model. In this case, we don't incorporate the added functionality of human environment feedbacks in this simulation for a variety of reasons I'm not going to go into. But there are a couple things I want to point out on this graph, which is the global area of the different land covers. One is that already when we go to 1 degree, we lose some difference in the initial forest area. In the previous graph, you saw it was 5 million square kilometers. This is now 4 million square kilometers. So the resolution makes a difference in our initial land cover. And then we would also have expected that this difference at the end of the simulation would be the same as at the beginning, because we have the same exact land use forcing, we use the same exact land conversion assumptions, but we don't get the same differences. Right? We're driving this with the changes in land use over time. And one reason for that is when you have more forest, you have less forest that you can add. So this original RCP 4.5 was an afforestation scenario, and so we're trying to add forest to meet the climate target, and the model, there are constraints that if there's more forest, you can't add as much to meet that constraint. Luckily, this changes only about 13%, so we can still use this as an estimate of how the uncertainties are affected by these initial conditions. So the spatial distribution of the difference is pretty much the same. That's what I'm showing here. But I'm going to move on to the results. So this table shows the atmospheric CO2 concentrations, both in 2005 and 2094. One thing I want to point out is that the 6 part per million difference between the maximum forest and the minimum forest initial condition is 25% of that variability that I showed you on the first slide. So the 25% of the variability across 11 other Earth system models. And this is just due to land conversion assumption uncertainty. It doesn't include land use uncertainty. We've seen earlier, it doesn't include methodological uncertainty and how the models implement land use and land cover change. It's just land conversion uncertainty. So this is a big chunk of that variability that is not necessarily associated with biogeochemical processes. And then after 90 years of simulation, that difference is increased by 50% to 9 parts per million. And you can see that here. The difference plot is on the right. It's moving from the 6 parts per million difference to 9. So it's not super exciting, but we also have changes in the terrestrial carbon stock. So the 26 part per million difference at the beginning of the simulation is 13% of that net biome production estimate from the beginning. Now these were calculated in different ways, so they're not exactly apples to apples comparison, but it gives you an idea of how much that is. But this terrestrial carbon stock difference is also increased by 27% to 33 petagrams of carbon by the end of the simulation. And then getting to the temperature difference, what I'm showing you here is the atmosphere, the bottom of the atmosphere temperature, not the 2 meter temperature. If I were to put up the 2 meter temperature, these ranges would actually be doubled. So there's a much larger uncertainty range at 2 meters than it is in the atmospheric layer. And we use the atmosphere layer because when we're doing this, we're thinking about how land use cover change influences climate. And I want to point out that this is almost a degree from minus 0.6, or just over a degree, minus 0.6 to 0.7. A lot of the warming associated with having more forest is in this mid to upper northern latitudes where there's more forest. And that I also want to point out that, so this top one is the annual average, but if we look at just the winter average, the December, January, February, that is the season with the largest range. It's over 2 degrees. And that does, I've gotten questions about this before, that does have to do with albedo and radiation effects. There is some light. And the other thing I want to point out is that these differences are on the same order of estimates of the effects of land use and land cover change on climate and on surface temperature. So this really contributes to some of the conclusions that people have made about comparing different models in order to understand the effects of land use and land cover change, where the models don't agree. And the models don't agree in large part because the land cover is different across the models. And so this really speaks to the need for more standardization across this if we really want to use multi-model comparisons to understand land use, land cover, land management effects on climate. And so just to summarize, again, I mentioned that the uncertainty in 2005 that we're seeing is about 25% of previous estimates of the variability in model projections for atmospheric CO2. 4 million square kilometer difference in initial forest area, which is actually quite large. I forgot to mention that the estimates of circa 2000, 2005 global forest area range from about 28 million square kilometers to 42, 43 million square kilometers. So this is almost a third of that range of estimates. That gives us a 50% increase in atmospheric CO2 uncertainty, a 27% increase in ecosystem carbon uncertainty, and annual temperature difference range of just over 1 degree. Well, one thing I didn't show you, I wanted to point out that you can have much smaller differences in initial forest area that also generate differences in carbon and temperature. But if you have convergence of your forest area over that period, you can actually reduce these differences over time rather than the increases that I was showing you. But the simulation that we were comparing against with this was the maximum forest in the default simulation. And so that the reference you use, the baseline, is very important when you're looking at these uncertainties. But you also have to recall that we didn't use the default because it uses a different method. We wanted to shrink our range of uncertainty variables. So we stuck with the same method. And then finally, we had this experience where the constraints in the model wouldn't allow us to add as much forest area as was prescribed because there was already a lot of forest. And so one thing we really have to consider is how the land use and land cover is implemented in the models. Are the constraints realistic? Do we need more constraints? How do we understand that in relation to the scenarios that are prescribed? And which comes to the bigger question of, should our models have high fidelity to the scenarios so we can understand them, or not? So, and I would say we do want fidelity with the scenarios. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Quite shocking. Any questions? I think you would have to speak up, please.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but like estimates of forest area even today, which are either remote sensing derived or FAO derived, have much more uncertainty than what you're showing. Like the FAO says we have 40 million spectrometers, for example. Some like researchers in America said we have, let's say, 56 million spectrometers. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. But your like estimates, I mean, at least to me, sound like your range of uncertainty in terms of forest area is much less.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is the case?
Because it's a single model, and a single model just based on just the land conversion assumptions. No land use differences, no differences in implementation, no differences in the method of how the land use was applied. And so, but we still get these pretty large results. And so then we think these models could have 10 million square kilometers difference in initial forest area. You can get even larger effects.
Any more questions? Yes? No? No? Then, yeah, thanks again, Ellen. And our next speaker is Christian Lauk. Coming, excellent. He'll compare biomass plantations and natural succession in terms of their carbon benefits.
Yeah. Hello to all. I will present a study about combating climate change through land conversion, carbon benefits from bioenergy plantations versus natural succession. Outline is the usual, I skipped that. So the motivation background of this study was that bioenergy remains important. It currently holds the largest share of all renewable energy sources still, and most low carbon energy scenarios include a large share of bioenergy in the future. And then second, the converting of spare agricultural land to short rotation copies especially appears often as beneficial option for biomass supply for bioenergy. But, and that is kind of the point of this study, the starting point is that spare land used for short rotation copies could alternatively be left to natural succession, thereby acting as a carbon sink. Well, against this background, we looked at the following questions. So how do natural succession and short rotation copies-based bioenergy compare in terms of cumulative carbon benefits per unit area if both carbon stock and fossil fuel displacement effects are considered? To what extent does the superior option depend on the considered bioenergy pathway and the fossil fuel and conversion route it displaces? And more generally, what do these findings imply for land-based global climate mitigation strategies and policies? We start in this study, this generic study, from a unit of spare land, cropland. Apart from food production, this cropland could be used in different ways, of which we compare basically two options in terms of their cumulative carbon benefits. The first option is that you use this spare land to grow short rotation copies for bioenergy. And here the carbon benefits are carbon accumulation of this short rotation copies plantation, plus the CO2 effect of displacing fossil fuels by the bioenergy derived from this plantation. And the second option is that you allow this area to regrow. And here the carbon benefit is only the carbon accumulation, as we assume that there is no harvesting on this area. So a little bit more about the methodology. Here you see two schemes which show the cumulative carbon benefits of these two considered options over time. So on the left, you see carbon benefits from short rotation copies based bioenergy, and shown in brown, black, and green, you see the carbon benefits from carbon accumulation, which here are rather low and quickly saturate, and you see the harvest cycle also. And shown in gray are the carbon benefits from the displacement of fossil fuels by bioenergy. And we assume that there is a full displacement of fossil fuels by bioenergy harvested from this land. And the size of this carbon benefit strongly depends on the replaced fossil fuel and energy conversion path. And it persists as long as fossil fuels can be replaced. That's also an important point. Sorry, that was too quick. On the right, you see carbon benefits, the scheme for carbon benefits from natural succession, and again in brown, black, and green, carbon benefits from carbon accumulation, which are here relatively higher and take longer to saturate. And there are, in this case, no carbon benefits from displacement of fossil fuels, again, as we assume no extraction of biomass from this area. To calculate the carbon benefits from natural succession, we derived representative carbon accumulation curves for 11 world regions and the globe. And here we rely on the assumption on carbon stock changes from the IPCC guidelines and default parameters for different pedoclimatic conditions, and to get one representative accumulation curve for each region and the world, we assume that natural succession takes place in proportion to the actual cropland distribution, current cropland distribution. And also following IPCC default values, we assume linear growth curves for biomass stocks, but we illustrate the relevance of this simplification by comparing them to non-linear growth curves. You see these below as an example. Now, to assess carbon benefits from the displacement of fossil fuels by the short rotation copious bioenergy, it's important to consider that these benefits depend on the concerned fuel and conversion path. So, for example, if biomass is used to produce liquid biofuels, a large share of carbon in biomass is lost during the conversion process to liquid fuel. So this is important to consider this type of conversion path that is replaced. And to quantify this effect, we use displacement factors, which define the comparative efficiency of reference versus bioenergy case in terms of CO2 emissions per unit of final energy for liquid fuel, heat, electricity. And we first calculate carbon benefits of bioenergy compared to the reference for a range of displacement factors from 0.1 to 1. And then to put this range into perspective, we compare these displacement factor ranges to actual bioenergy options and reference fuels that are calculated. So I show this becomes clearer, I think, then in the results, which I will show now. What you see here as first main result are the cumulative carbon benefits over time from 20 to 100 years for the two considered options, and for 5 selected world regions and the global weighted average on the right. And as black and red dotted lines for different carbon accumulation curves, you see the carbon benefit from due to natural succession. So for the case that you let forest or natural vegetation on this patch regrow, and in differently colored lines, you see cumulative carbon benefits of bioenergy from short rotation copies for different displacement factors. And you see there's a large range depending on what you assume this bioenergy would actually replace, which kind of bioenergy it would replace. And so, for example, if you look on the right on the global weighted average for a time frame of about 30 to 50 years, show this, I hope yeah. So that would be here, yeah. You see that bioenergy from short rotation copies yields higher carbon benefits only for technologies with a displacement factor higher than 0.4. So what does this displacement factor actually mean? And this I will show on the next slide. And here you see in the upper graph, in a different way, relative carbon benefits from natural succession versus bioenergy from short rotation copies for different displacement factors and time frames. Different time frames are shown here as different curves. And here in this, so if it's above 100%, that means that natural succession is, in terms of carbon benefits, superior to bioenergy from SRC. And if it's for those cases below 100%, it means that the bioenergy is superior in terms of its carbon balance. And again, if you look now at the time frame of 30 to 50 years, which means up to 2050, 2070, only technologies with a displacement factor of more than 0.4 should be considered from a climate mitigation perspective. And now the lower graph puts this into perspective by showing the displacement factors from literature for different technologies, for different energy conversion routes. And here you see, for example, which is interesting, if you say, okay, 0.4 is the reasonable lower bound for bioenergy from short rotation copies. Transport fuels from, so second generation transport fuels, which are produced from wood, are not reasonable from a climate mitigation perspective. I mean, there are different reasons maybe, but not from this perspective. Okay, now I come to, it's okay, I come to discussion and conclusions. So I think this study shows that in the long term, the use of, one has to say, the use of short rotation copies-based bioenergy results in higher carbon savings than natural succession. But, and that's an important point, which we didn't look at, that's goes beyond the study, if it substitutes fully high carbon fossil fuels. So if you assume that this bioenergy partly comes on top because of some kind of rebound effect, that would even look worse for bioenergy. So, but for timeframes of 20 to 50 years, natural succession can be competitive or even superior to many bioenergy options, especially second generation biofuels. And now in a more general policy context, I think it's important to consider more generally, of course, here risks and co-benefits of both options, which we didn't look at in detail. For natural succession, you have decreasing growth of carbon stocks over time. So, but on the other hand, you have co-benefits for biodiversity and ecosystem services. I think that fits to the buzzword of natural climate solutions that you recently hear more and more. And for bioenergy, on the other hand, you have ecological risks of short rotation coppice plantations, but also, of course, co-benefits in terms of energy security. And I think, but overall, I would say our results provide evidence that renaturation or reforestation must seriously be considered as long-term climate mitigation option and alternative to bioenergy plantations. Thank you. Gerald Kalt is, I presented on behalf of him because he became father some weeks ago, so he decided to skip this conference.
Okay, so thanks to you, Christian. Congrats to Gerald. And questions from the audience? Mark.
I'm just wondering about the concept of spare land, which you defined as former cropland. If it's former cropland, then it was used to produce food, and the need to produce food isn't going away and won't go away in the future. So did you consider at all the indirect effects of the fact that if you're not using that land to produce food, then that food must be coming from somewhere else, and therefore you're displacing potentially deforestation to another part of the world?
I think that's an important point, actually. I'm fully aware of that. In this study, we actually really start from the assumption that there is some kind of spare land. And of course, I fully agree that this must be considered. And actually, within the larger project in which this study was conducted, we exactly looked also at this question. And I don't know, maybe some of you have heard the presentation of Michaela Teuerl yesterday, because we looked at different future options, especially in terms of biomass demand and how much spare land this would generate. So there are, I mean, now the question of changing human diets especially is a big topic, but also, and if you would assume, for example, a change to diets with lower share of meat and so on, you could actually generate a lot of spare land assuming that productivities remain or productivities continue to increase and so on. But we didn't look at that in this study. So this study really starts from the assumption that there is spare land. Helmut is also part of the. Yeah.
I can add, if you consider putting bioenergy anywhere, you always face these two options. Yeah? So in any case where you consider putting bioenergy crops somewhere, you must assume that this land is available or it is made available, and then the carbon costs of doing so are the same. So you can treat this as a ceteris paribus condition in this study, I think. I think this is a valid consideration.
I think we're facing a coffee time discussion here, but there's a question up there.
Thanks, Christian. I would like to piggyback on that question and ask if you do it in the right way, would you agree that we should consider only degraded agricultural land as spare land because of future options of other agricultural land? And if so, how do we get there?
Actually, at least in this study, we didn't make this assumption because, as I said, we assumed in terms of conditions to derive these carbon accumulation curves, we assumed the actual cropland distribution. So not only degraded land, that is actually highly productive land. And I mean, the question is also, where is this degraded land actually? So, but I think it goes a little bit beyond this study. In this study, we assume that somehow, because of changing demand, especially some and higher productivities, some also high productivity land becomes available. But I think it's an important question, yeah. So this.
Okay, two more questions.
Yeah. Just a comment. I think the comparison is really amazing and brings a lot of questions. And one is that the uncertainty of the comparison is not only on the side of the bioenergy scheme that we use, but also on what nature is going to do. If we are starting in degraded land, sometimes nature can take a long time to take off. And perhaps there's a lot of room for the exploration of assisted successions.
Mm-hmm.
In which we deal with the takeoff of the system and the other big problem that can be fires. In presentations yesterday, we have seen how abandoned land goes into new fire regimes that were suppressed by agriculture. So I think there's a lot of room for the exploration of these intermediate pathways.
Yeah.
Which create nature in a way.
Yeah, I fully agree. So, I mean, this is a first quite generic study that shows this on a global scale. That this is, I think, also under-researched topic, and it would certainly make sense to complement this with more detailed, also regional scale studies that look at more specific questions. So it rather opens up a little bit this space.
Thank you. That was really interesting, the comparison. I wonder about the nutrient implications of the two alternatives you presented and whether the short rotation scenario can actually function without additional nutrient inputs, which would have well, all kinds of other effects, including climate forcing.
Mm. Yeah, that's another good question, I think, actually, and I didn't say that, but we didn't consider upstream and downstream emissions. So, for example, emissions from the production of fertilizers that you would use in short rotation coppice plantations, probably in many cases, that would increase somehow the emissions also even further. So, but we didn't look at that. So, but I agree. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there are many aspects, more aspects that need to be explored here, I think.
Good. Thanks again, Christian, very much. And thanks to all the speakers of the session. If you like the session, you can tweet about it, or even better, you come back right after lunch, same room, part B. Yeah. Okay, thanks.